I'll just talk briefly about this. The Stroud Center is focused on research, education, and watershed restoration primarily of freshwater systems. StroudCenter.org is the website. There's lots of materials there. They're founded in 1967. Stroud was a part of the Academy of Natural Sciences initially, kind of an offshoot. Joan Milliken Stroud, Dixon Stroud, and Dr. Ruth Patrick were sort of the three original folks involved, the property owners and the researcher with the Academy. There's Ruth out in the streams. The first person she hired was Robin Van Oat. He was the first director of the center. He was followed by Bern Sweeney, who a lot of you, if you have known Stroud over the years, you've probably heard of Bern. He was here for a lot of years. He's retired now, but he still is around here from time to time and still keeping up with some of his research, collecting bugs down in Florida where he lives now, bringing them back to identify them and hope to identify new species and such. And Dave Arscott is the current director. So Stroud isn't a nonprofit. It's about 50 employees, quite a few PhD level scientists, a lot of others with master's degrees. There are quite a few interns that come in, especially in the summer. There's a lot of interns going around right now. A lot of them are identifying bugs, just churning through macroinvertebrate samples. There are volunteers involved. Carol is one such volunteer for the Stroud Center. So Stroud is located pretty close to Delaware, just here in southeastern PA, just west of Philly, kind of northwest of Wilmington. That's the headquarters in southeastern PA. There's also a preserve, a Stroud Preserve. It's a Natural Lands Trust preserve that Stroud does research on as well locally. And then there's also a research station in Costa Rica. So there's part of the campus here that I'm at right now. I'm in this room right here, actually, as we speak. This is the new building, the LEED Platinum certified. There's the Stroud Preserve where research happens. This is also a research watershed itself, 50 some acres. The east branch of the White Clay flows through here, and so there's a lot of experiments and research that goes on right on campus. And then there's the Costa Rica Maritza station. Here's a little video that'll quick go through, just going over the campus here. This is sort of some of the original older buildings. This is where a lot of the lab space is. This is an old 1700s cabin. It was one of the original things on campus. Here's the new buildings. And then the stream flows down here. This is going up into the headwaters. Here's our parking and such. This is an old mushroom house that's used for storage. Here's some fields that are currently used for experimental hemp growing. It's a greenhouse with experimental flumes in it. This is green stormwater infrastructure and wastewater here. And this is the general region of the southeastern PA around Avondale and Kennett Square and that general region. Okay, so a little video there. So Stroud started out with a National Science Foundation involvement as an experimental ecological reserve in '81, money that way. Stroud became exceptional value. The east branch of the White Clay became an exceptional value stream in the '80s as well. That's the stream that the research is done on. So, you know, originally when Stroud started, it was research, education. The education department came in the 1990s. They currently bring through thousands of students a year. And then restoration came on more recently. They do primarily agricultural restoration, doing kind of holistic watershed restoration, which they try to get as many farms as possible within watersheds to basically make it happen. Interdisciplinary team research, there's a lot of different folks at Stroud doing a lot of different things, and they collaborate on many different projects. One of the initial grants was a Rockefeller grant in 1969 to sort of just look at overall holistic stream ecology and how all the different parts fit together, from riparian zones and leaves to sunlight to microorganisms to bugs and fish. And this sort of led into this river continuum concept, which is a ongoing concept that is continually developed with more and more papers. It's just the idea that streams start small and higher gradient streams, there's more leaf debris, there's less sunlight, which causes a different community to exist in these. When the streams get bigger, get more sunlight, have less leaf entry, have more sediment, the streams flatten out, that creates different communities. That paper, that Van Oat paper, published in 1980, is the most cited paper in all of freshwater literature. So it gives you a concept as to how impactful that paper from the Stroud Center back then has been on the freshwater ecology research community. So lots of different research tangents coming out of that general river continuum concept idea. Water temperature, lots of water temperature studies going on. Riparian forest buffers, I'm sure everyone here knows the importance of that. Agricultural restoration and tying in with buffers, all that type of stuff is continually being researched at Stroud Center and elsewhere. It's as the title notes, it's a large scale perspective. So this concept was sort of developed, or focused in Eastern forests, but really does apply to other regions and was confirmed with data from other regions. Stroud Center funding comes from a lot of different sources. Lots of collaborators, universities, schools, private agencies, lots and lots of watershed groups. And that's my overview of the Stroud Center. Any questions about that? Just sort of basic overview of the organization. Okay, so I will go into plastics. So I don't know if this title is the best. I have it as a brief overview of microplastics and plastics sources and potential risks to animals, including humans. So I don't know, I'm trying to just sort of get at the basics of plastics and microplastics, and generally try to get at some sort of main points of why these things are of concern from the bulk level down to the micro level, and try to get into some of the details of that, so there's some kind of science context here about how things link up and affect things within the broader kind of connectivity of the world of natural ecosystems and ecosystems in general. Ecosystems are natural inherently. There's a tray of microplastics. You're getting an idea here. Dust, micro dust up to parts that you can kind of see. And like I said, please feel free to just chime in with questions or whatever. So as I think we all know, plastics production has just been increasing and increasing over the decades. And projected to increase even more dramatically in future years. As strange as that might seem, that is what has been predicted. And as folks who are cited on the Plastics Free Delaware website have noted, one of the politicians cited on there noted in a speech that she made that just within the pandemic, plastics usage increased like 100-fold or something. So there's other reasons though for this projected increase, because this projected increase was, I think, done before the pandemic even happened. And one of those reasons seems to be these cracker plants, so-called cracker plants. And here's a little snippet about those. I'm just going to read it because it's here. And I think it gives a key into some of the sort of details around these plants and how it ties in with sort of the beast of the energy industry and so on, and ways to just sort of get the plastics out there in ways that are efficient for them apparently, but not very efficient for anyone else or in any way good for the environment at many levels. So an important component of gas and a byproduct of oil refinery operations, ethane is an odorless hydrocarbon that when heated to an extremely high temperature to crack its molecules apart produces ethylene. 3 reactors combine ethylene with catalyst to create polyethylene. And a 2,200-ton, 285-foot tall quench tower cools down the cracked gas and removes pollutants. That final product is then turned into virgin plastic pellets. So there's a lot going on there, but these virgin plastic pellets are then used for all different kinds of things within plastics production.
And David, I'm going to pipe up just for a second, just to
Sure.
mention that the recent train derailment up in Bucks County, they were carrying these pellets.
Yeah, and so the pellets themselves become like pollutants because there's huge amounts of them being transported all over the country. And they get out there and they're out there. And they look like, you know, at a very coarse level, they're often mistaken for things that animals can eat. And you have guts of birds, for instance, that get filled with microplastics and they think they're full and they're malnutrition because they're eating plastics. They're choosing plastics over real food. As you might expect, plastics increase with population density, per capita, and also with sort of money at times too. Here's just some stats on countries. So total plastic waste, United States, India, China, kind of Brazil, probably the ones you might expect. Germany's big up there. Most into the ocean. These are, as you might expect, ones that are close to the ocean. Some of these are also kind of have higher per capita. So some of these, even though they have smaller populations, make more plastic. This sort of Southeastern Asia area is particularly bad. This is plastic waste across the world, mismanaged plastic waste. It's kind of hard to see. This is so small by one to show the whole thing. The US is all the way down here, and you see how problematic managing waste is in our country. And you look up here at some of these others, Philippines, China, India. I mean, and it makes you understand why you have beaches in certain parts of the world that are completely covered in plastics. I guess in this country, we at least have some sort of control over landfills and making sure that at least some component of the plastics, or at least a majority of the plastics actually, and trash in general, make it to the landfills.
I might just chime in there though and add that part of the problem that's highlighted in this graph is that developed countries, so-called developed countries like ours, ship a lot of our waste over to those countries that are at the top of the list. So we're not immune to this problem. We shouldn't look at this graph and blame it on those at the top of the list and say, oh, look how good we're doing. We're part of the problem for that whole upper part of the curve.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, and the whole the concept of recycling as well is that a lot of those are being shipped off to other areas for supposed recycling, and you don't know what's happening at that point either. And as the graph before pointed out, the US is the largest manufacturer of plastics. So moving on, plastic use, this is sort of just a graph describing, just where plastic is being used. So obviously a whole lot of packaging. It's everywhere. Construction, other sectors, textiles is a big one. We'll see that textiles and consumer products are some of the main sources of microplastics. Different types of plastics out there. I just wanted to put this in there just to give a sort of a flavor for all the different types of plastics that are out there, the names of the particular plastics and the types of uses that they have. So a lot of like different types of plastics going into packaging and such. Electrical appliances here, window frames and pipes and flooring and bottles, PET, big one for bottles. So a lot of plastics are not recycled. A lot are going into landfills. Not that that's a great solution, but it's at least better than them going out into the environment. 8.5 are apparently recycled. I mean, again, these data are a little bit old, but as we're starting to figure out, even recycling has a lot of issues.
Yeah,
So
oh, sorry.
go ahead, Carol.
Well, you're going to get to that really important recent study, but this data, as you say, is old, and that's because this was during an era. Anyway, the EPA didn't continue to publish this data. That's why we can't get updates on it. But the interesting thing to me is that the rate of recycling has not changed in 30 years, or maybe even back in the 80s, so that maybe more than 30 years ago, we were recycling at the same level that we're recycling now. And that's a very disappointing fact. Also, we're producing a hell of a lot more plastics now, so that adds to the complication. But the Department of Energy and the EPA reported recently that we're actually recycling at a 5 to 6% level, not. So the sources of these data is strange to me that there's such variances, but I think the EPA and the DOE are a pretty important source of information. So there's nothing aspirational about what we've done so far.
Yeah, and even recycling at the start, I'm not an expert, but I've heard the argument that even recycling was sort of promoted by the industry to kind of put the problem onto the people to deal with, because the idea is just produce as much as possible and then whatever, let the consumers deal with the waste. Recycling takes energy and it creates waste itself too. So, just stopping and just hoping in the long term to just phase plastic out. Boy, would that be even possible? Seems like it'd be a miracle, but that seems like would be the ideal. So anyway, with a group like this, there's probably not really a question as to whether plastics are a problem, but this is just a quote from a 2016 paper. There are certain human environmental perturbations so major that they are capable of destabilizing the Earth's normal function at a global scale. These so-called planetary boundary threats include climate change, ozone depletion, and ocean acidification. Emerging as a novel addition to this list is the vast quantity of discarded plastic waste that is accumulating in the oceans on an unprecedented scale, where it breaks down to form microscopic and nanoscopic fragments or microplastics. So it's out there and it's pretty wild. as it starts to break down, because there's all kinds of things that start happening when these things break down. So noting the nice the material available on the plastic-free Delaware website. This is from the Senator Stephanie Hanson's comments. I'm guessing at least some of you have seen this, but I wanted to actually point this out as well. We know how bad plastics are. We know how bad they are when they degrade into our ecosystems, when they degrade into microplastics. They are everywhere. We have an addiction that was fueled by the pandemic. I think it's 200 to 200 times more plastics that we now have in use than we did pre-pandemic, because of everything is single use. And we're very focused on that. We have to dial it back. And then she responds about the trash pickups that she's been involved with and what they've noted. There are thousands and thousands of these pieces, from sizes that you can pick up to sizes that you can't. You can't pick it all up because it's tiny little pieces. So you have to leave it there. So, and that's stuff that you could see. You know, microplastic, even the stuff that you can see that you can barely see, will continue breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. And they're finding, I quote a paper, 2023 paper recently, a little later, where remote voyages all over the world on sea vessels, every single one collected microplastics in samples from ocean water. So getting into details of microplastics, technically anything less than 5 millimeters, microbeads and microfragments, large ions broken down in environment films, pellets, nurdles, all types of microfibers. These nurdles are what we referred to earlier, those beads. They're often referred to as nurdles. So as I've been saying, plastic just does not go away. It just, even if it seems to go away, it's just disappearing via finer and finer plastic dust, basically. Where's it coming from? Everyone probably knows this, but just as a quick review, you know, your plastic bottles, UV radiation, wave action, etc., just general jarring can knock these things apart. Clothing, fibers that go into the water in your washing machine and then go out to the treatment plant. Those fibers are a major source of microplastics in water, flowing water, in drinking water. Those little plastic pellets that we mentioned, lots of plastic products in personal hygiene products. These microbeads are very common. It's amazing that these things are legal.
The microbeads actually aren't legal in body washes and that sort of thing anymore. Yeah. Congress did a legislation on that a few years ago that outlawed them. So if you're seeing them, please let us know. I'll report them. But they're not supposed to be in those products, those micro.
Is that nationally? Is that national?
Yeah, it was a national bill.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's true, Dee, but the problem is that they're still being found in detergents, and they're used by industry when they do abrasives to clean something. They use it in paint mixtures. So yeah. These are methods that are used in the out of doors.
Yeah.
And so these microbeads are coming not just from our the law involved personal care products, but it didn't involve detergents, for example.
Yeah. Yep.
So, you know, getting the point here, here's some sort of close-up examples of really what they look like, you know, when you look at them under a microscope, all different kinds of actual objects, you know, from different types of plastic with different types of chemicals associated with them, different ways of breaking down, different ways of interacting with other chemicals that may be in contact with. Sort of just a rendition here of the idea of like just smaller and smaller particles continuing to break down into even smaller particles. Fibers, you know, this idea of fibers breaking into more fibers. Just getting more and more micro to the point that potentially they're able to cross cell membranes and so on and so forth. Here's some definitions of microplastics. Like I say, macroplastics are above 5 millimeters. Micro, technically between 0.1 micromillimeters. And then nanoplastics below that, 1 micron. That's small. You can see here the comparison to a clay particle. A clay particle is the smallest, particle you can find in sediment, for instance. The feel of clay in your fingers. It's very, very smooth. It's because the particles are so small, and you see these nanoparticles are getting much smaller than that. Just a little more description of the types of micros and where they're coming from: flakes, beads, fibers from clothes, flakes from your more bags and bottles and such. I can probably skip through a lot of this stuff. This is just more talking about the types of plastics. Here's more about these nurdles. Like I mentioned, these things can get eaten. They leach chemicals. Another thing that's happening with these when they're in the environment is they start forming different communities of organisms. So, and you can see these, in streams and rivers, out in the ocean, these big masses of plastics are having strange communities of organisms living on them, which, as you can imagine, has the potential to affect other organisms. Fishing line and stuff, that's well-known issue with plastics. Microfibers, as we mentioned, these seem to be from clothing. Probably all of us today most likely have some sort of plastics-based clothing on. Personally, I've been trying to just kind of phase those out and just replace plastic clothing as I can with natural fabric, organic, ideally. So here's some of those stats from a 2020 study, of waste. This is wastewater treatment water. So 51% of the microplastics in wastewater treatment plant were fibers, presumably from clothes. Another recent study here, this was out of Europe, and this is sort of new. And Carol, maybe you have something more I just sort of happened onto this, but this is sort of all the other microplastics, and they were sort of putting paint in here as a small component. And they're now noting that all of these sort of paint associated microplastics are seeming to be a huge source. I don't know, Carol, have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I think that part of it is because more studies analyzing the actual
Yep.
polymers are coming out and
Yep.
helping us realize this. But I know that it's in the oceans in particular, it's a common source. I have not heard that 58% of the microplastics in the water are from roads. Of course, this is maybe more than, I don't.
Yeah,
there are things on roads that get washed in. It's not just the paint.
Yeah, this is from a lot of different sources. There's a specific report here associated with, and this is just in 2023. But they do say this is tires. This is tires.
Right.
Tire dust that they're referring to.
Oh,
here.
and textiles. Okay.
And that is a big thing as well. Tire dust, or in tires, chemicals from tires. Folks here, I don't know if you've heard about, there was a study from the Northwest that found toxic chemicals from tires were causing fish kills.
Right. After
salmon fish kills in the northwestern US.
Right. It was causing quickly because it's so toxic to them, but there have been at least 2 studies that found this is also happening in the Northeast to certain certain trout populations. They're both salmonids, cold water
Yep.
fishes that are, so there are certain of our native trout that are just as sensitive to these, is it 6 quinone, 6 ppd quinone, something
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
chemical in the
Yeah.
in the tires.
So,
Yeah, very
this is not really surprising. Plastic and oil products are used everywhere, and there really obviously has not been long-term proper risk assessment as far as like risk to the environment, risk to animals and plants and other organisms that come in contact with these things. The beast of industry just moves forward, and we kind of pick things up and adjust as we can. The PFAS, the perfluorinated compounds, are another example of just things that get used because they're functional, but and they do some risk assessment, but in the long term, then they start finding out that there are a lot more risks associated with these man-made things that get put out there in large quantities for all kinds of things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So I mentioned, evidence of finding these things all over. This is wet deposition in the Rocky Mountains. Not over 90% of the samples had microplastics. A little more about microplastics in freshwater and their sources. You can see effluents, influence and effluents from treatment plants, major sources, as you might expect, because that's just stuff that's coming from people's houses, whatever they're washing down the drains, whatever's going down their washing machines and such. A little lower in rivers and lakes a little higher, but rivers lower, canals lower, presumably because those are sourced not only by treatment plant effluents, but groundwater and rainwater and runoff and so on. Groundwater pretty low. Look at untreated tap water. Look at even treated tap water. Look at bottled water. So bottled water, you're not only buying plastic, but you're actually ingesting quite a bit of plastic in the water that is being served to you in a water bottle. But it's kind of the case in treated water as well. So maybe people living in rural areas who are on groundwater are the best off. I don't know. And all this just, please definitely keep in mind, this is there's just research paper after research paper after research paper coming out, articulating more and more detail in the science of this. I'll note later there's an actual journal, Microplastics journal, that is exclusively dedicated to microplastics. So release into the environment. Again, this is sort of some of the stuff we've already been talking about. Treatment plants, some of the biosludge from these treatment plants gets used in agriculture. So this biosludge gets on to agricultural fields, and then it's exposing the water in those systems, as well as the plants and soil to those plastics and whatever else is in that biosludge, the chemicals associated with those plastics and anything else, PFAS, for instance. We mentioned tire dust as a source as well. All kinds of industrial fluids, dumping, landfills, certainly, even though landfills will contain the plastics, there's still plenty of stuff happening there. We mentioned atmospheric deposition, air and water, and then of course just litter. And we note in the Plastic-Free Delaware work that the plastics bag ban has had a major effect on litter, apparently. That's the impression I got from the website. So congratulations to you all for that, because that really is seeming to be a major accomplishment. So sort of just some stats on, you know, where these are being found, how much are being ingested. You know, tap water, it's found in tap water, it's being found in, you know, in fish, in sea salt. It's like, where is it not found? Beer brands being tested in the rain. And then there's these stats like this of like over 5,800 particles per year. And I think a more recent study I saw, it was like a lot more than that. Here's again, bottled water, you know, the top source of microplastics that we eat and drink, according to this study. This was just sort of a reference to some of these strange things that then can happen with colonization of microplastics with bacteria and fungi, diatoms, and different other little creatures that can inhabit these, which are then going to be themselves contaminated with whatever chemicals are leaching from those plastic particles, and or chemicals that have adsorbed to those particles and then are released from those particles and taken up by those creatures. And then, as we know, those creatures can be eaten up by other creatures, biomagnify, bioaccumulate, that type of stuff. So just mentioning here explicitly that there are chemicals, you know, there's the chemical component with these plastics, that is the chemicals actually associated with the plastics themselves in their making, in their composition, but then the chemicals that can be absorbed to those plastics. So the chemical component of the plastics in macroplastics and or microplastics. I think the microplastics are considered more of an issue because those can just be actively ingested by organisms and then potentially even cross boundaries within organisms, cell boundaries and such. The macroplastics are still doing the same thing, but they're just not, you know, necessarily being ingested as frequently as the microplastics. But then there's also the physical bulk of the microplastics, the small macroplastics, and even the big macroplastics of like these things just getting ingested and just filling digestive tracts of animals with plastics as opposed to actual food and causing malnutrition that way, as well as whatever else may happen chemically. So, you know, just some examples here: oxidative stress, reduced feeding, immune dysfunction, mortality. So this is that idea of additives releasing from the microplastics, pollutants absorbing to microplastics, and then reintroducing them into these systems. And this is just an astounding stat. And there's another thing I'll mention here about this, but plastics can absorb more than 1 million times density of what is in the water column. So they're like sponges sucking in potentially all kinds of nasty chemicals in the environments in which they have polluted. And then you get this sort of just general sort of process of the microplastics going into any number of different organisms, the microorganism level, aquatic, terrestrial organisms, getting into the gut. And we are no different than any of these organisms in which there are currently unknown, a lot of unknown health risks with plastics, with microplastics, the chemicals associated with them, and all kinds of other pollutants that are in the environment because of our societal inability to really contain our wastes so that we aren't sort of just exposed to a lot of toxic materials associated with all of the products that are out in the environment, and they're just shedding all of this waste material that then is in the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat. So this is just some more information along those lines. I don't want to be too redundant here. Carol, please chime in if there's anything in these types of slides that would be good to kind of point out a little more explicitly.
There's so much to say, huh?
I know. I mean, this type of thing, this type of stat, it's just filling guts with other things.
Well, I guess I want to point out too that I think that we may think that the greatest risk is from the gastrointestinal system, but actually, we found that, so the smaller the microplastic, the greater the damages. So this copepod study here, the copepods started rejecting the pieces of microplastics that were fed to them in their water, and started then rejecting other real sources of food that had the same dimension of the microplastic. So it starts changing what they consider to be prey, but also even smaller organisms die. So there was one study that compared 3 nanosizes, and so they were all nanosizes of plastic. The smallest nanosize was the one that killed off this Daphne Magia, I'm forgetting, but this particular zooplankton that fish eat killed them off within 24 hours. And then the fish that ate those zooplankton, their feeding behavior started slowing down and becoming imprecise. So the point that I interrupted for was that it's not only in the digestive systems, it's from the digestive system, it's been shown scientifically that the microplastics and their chemicals can go through the cell walls into the immune system. So, and we know it's in our brains and our blood and our lungs and our organs. So
this
this
slide,
one here, exactly.
this slide sort of addresses that, where these microplastics of a certain size can just cross these boundaries.
Right. And once they're in the lymph
this,
system, they're in the immune system.
Yeah. So how much time do we have here, Dee?
Well, we usually go to about 1 or 1:15. So
okay. So I should probably go along here. So
it's up
this
to you.
is just I can share this Carol and I can share this presentation. There's a lot of information here. These are some of the other chemicals that can kind of just be associated, and sort of some of their effects. It's more of a resource slide. Some chemicals that can get absorbed to plastics. Here's some of the studies I wanted to mention. Carol mentioned plastics deep in lungs, being found deep in the lungs of human lung tissue. One thing just here that I thought was really striking: the ubiquity of microplastics within the environment results in background contamination in any study, even after strict quality control measures are applied. So even in sterile experimental settings, it's very hard for them to control for microplastics because they are so rampant in the environment. This is just a local Susquehanna study showing increased microplastics in fish. Here's another study. I did put in some QR codes if folks want to access these. This is that study I mentioned of samples being taken all over the world, and essentially just finding microplastics. They said they found microplastics in every sample. And you can imagine why that's the case. All these plastics are out in the environment, and with UV radiation, with just physical movement of things, they just keep breaking down into smaller and smaller and smaller particles, and movement of the ocean, currents, so on and so forth, they just get distributed. Another one about microplastics getting lodged in airways.
Are any of these studies, maybe I should ask, do I know obviously at Stroud, you do a lot of sampling and whatnot. Are you sampling for these chemicals and microparticles and nanoparticles of plastic?
I don't know of anyone specifically, like, really at a research level doing microplastics work at this point.
At
Um,
Stroud?
At Stroud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
was just curious.
it's a pretty specialized area. There are some folks working on PFAS at this point. And there's certainly, I should, there's probably been some people touching on it in some ways or another, but there's no one that's focused on it.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, just
Um,
curious.
So, I mentioned this is the Microplastics Journal. I included the QR code here for this particular, it was a recent sort of assemblage of papers from that. And it just gives you an idea of, how much research is just being done all the time. It's just, rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And the more you look, the more you see. So I will try to wrap up here with the final sort of some roadmaps. There's a lot of different suggestions that are out there for what to do. Waste is a big one, holding producers accountable. You guys are all doing this with plastic free Delaware. A lot about waste and consumption, and just phasing plastics out basically is the ultimate, I think, best way to go about doing things. Certainly this environmental justice and social justice issue is prominent, as with a lot of other pollution issues. This is a nice list that Carol put together. And her first thing is just move away from plastics. It's just like, whenever possible, just move away. Certainly reusing things, keeping track of how you're using things, diary, notebook, whatever. Trying to buy in bulk. Eating in restaurants even. There's a lot of waste from getting takeout from restaurants. Replacing your clothing with natural fiber clothing. Trying to reduce how much of your trash gets out into the environment. Giving up bottled water, absolutely. Buying in bulk, so on and so forth. Here is another list from NRDC. Wean off disposable plastics, stop buying water, boycott microbeads, cook more, stop eating out and getting takeout containers, secondhand items, recycling. Again, some of these types of things, you're still keeping plastic items in circulation, and they're, although you're not buying, first use new plastic, you're still kind of keeping it in circulation. So I think there's probably room for discussion around those things. And I'm curious as to what Carol would have to say about that. Bag tax or ban, yay, Delaware. And, trying to be active in the community. Here's the list from PFD, looking at your own purchasing, buying in bulk, just scaling back. And they're even addressing other things, just more generally about energy and such. And they mention recycling. However, this study here, which I didn't have a QR code for this, but it links to the study, which I'll get to in the next slide. Shedding and washing of plastic in recycling facilities may turn as much as 6 to 13% of incoming waste into microplastics. Perhaps as much as 400,000 tons per year in the United States alone, or the equivalent of about 29,000 dump trucks of microplastics, going out into the environment via the wastewater. So, and that this is the exact study. Here's the QR code if folks want it. This is a European study. This is a quote from one of the people in the study. It seems quite backward to me, said plastics researcher who led the research while she was a graduate student. With plastic recycling, we have designed and initiated it in order to start protecting our environment. I think this study has shown that we have ended up creating a different, if potentially slightly worse problem. And so that really speaks to the point of like, it's, you know, it's well-intentioned to turn plastic stuff into other usable items. And those items are useful, and that's why people like plastics. That's why it's gone crazy. It's because they're functional items on a day-to-day basis. But anything that is recycled and starts being used as another source that is out in the environment, such as clothes, such as bags, is still presumably shedding microplastics into the environment. So, Carol, any commentary on that idea of the sort of the risk reward with regard to recycling and recycled plastic clothes and repurposed plastic materials, so on and so forth?
Thanks, David. Well, the issue is that every time, as you said a couple of times now, the more you look, the more you find. And so because every single economically viable issue we've thought of still has too great a cost associated with it for the relative benefits, that there really is only if we want to slow down. I mean, remember, these are all plastics, no matter what size they are, they're going to remain. They're not going to biodecompose for hundreds, if not longer years, right? Hundreds or thousands of years. All of these things are remaining on the planet. And that's why we have to stop the flow. I mean, that's where we've got, I think everyone needs to transfer their thinking to that. And one point I'd really like to make about the issue of our clothing and washing machines. So you showed one slide. Every single study I've read, I should say virtually every single study I've read has shown from around the world that those microfibers are the most common fiber type of particle found in water. The thing is, I don't think that's, in other words, that's found off the coast of Scotland, that's found off the coast of Malaysia, that's found around the world. And yet I don't think that's all coming from washing machines. I don't think the population density justifies it. I don't think people's use of the agitating washing machines justify it. I think it's because there's more than clothing that it's coming from. We have to think about all the other textiles that we're using. Of course, the medical field is one, but all the landscaping we're doing. Well, think about what you're putting in your garden. Now, California has made a lot of changes, and that proves that you can make changes. But I was at a volunteer effort up in Massachusetts where they wanted to pull up the landscaping fabric that had been used 20 years ago. That fabric disintegrated into who knows how many magnitude greater trillion of microplastic fibers than I could see, right? I could see it. It was devastating how many fibers that had disintegrated into. So some people are interested in the bacteria that will break down plastics. Yes, there are some bacteria that, and of course, this is a hotly pursued area, that will biodegrade plastics, but that has to be added to the environment, those bacteria. There are other bacteria that will degrade plastics, but that's just breaking it down. So if you hear about technologies that will break down plastics, you have to definitely ask the hard questions of whether you're talking about biodegrading or just degrading. So I think we need to really think hard about our purchases.
Yeah,
that's the
thank
point
you, Carol. Wonderful points. So I wanted to put this in here just sort of like as a positive point. It really seems like this has just been tremendous. So congratulations to you all in Delaware for making this happen. The Rounds, I wanted to point out the Rounds is a service in Philadelphia where they use glass containers. They come to your house, pick up your empties, fill them with products, and return them to you. There's very little plastic usage. They seem like, making an earnest attempt to just not use plastic at all, or as minimally as possible, I should say. Not available in Wilmington yet, so I just sort of wanted to note that. This is another QR code to, this was a science talk, more of a science talk about, litter and microplastics in urban freshwater. It was done by the Symposium for Freshwater for Urbanization and Stream Ecology. Megan Fork, who's a professor at Westchester University, was involved with this. She's actually currently developing a study to compare areas of our region of southeastern PA, comparing regions that have had plastic bag bans with areas that have not, and looking at how that has impacted pollution and plastics in water. She was one of the hosts of this meeting. And that's what I have. I will stop share.
I could just add on to what David said. You are
Absolutely.
congratulated for what you've done, because Americans have made a really big change in how much plastic is being lost in the environment. We're doing a good job. All these volunteers, probably millions of volunteers who work for various government and nonprofit entities, are making having a big impact. And of course, when you take out the macroplastics, then you've removed even more microplastics than could be done with a technology.
Well, thanks, Carol and David for those nice words about our work. And Ellen is here. And others are trying to get a lot happening up in Pennsylvania, in Chester County, Delaware County, and so there's some movement there, especially with the political environment maybe improving there a little bit. Maybe Pennsylvania can join its surrounding states with getting some of this done. But yeah, it's a shame that that we have to, it's sort of a grassroots from the bottom up initiative, because as David pointed out early on in his presentation, we're fighting one of the largest industries in the world, right? So it's just us small people, battling the gas and oil companies, really, who see plastics as their future, as the use of oil for cars and heating and whatnot diminishes. They see plastics as their next frontier to grow their the economy that they have, the part of the economy that they have. So anyway, but I do think we are making progress, and the plastic movement is growing for sure, and getting information out like you've presented today, helps us all be more aware of the issue. So thanks so much, David, for being here today, and Carol for your input as well. Dave, I know you had tons of questions in the chat. I couldn't keep up with you.
Oh.
So I don't know if you want to pick one or two of your most important questions and ask them.
Well, I stuck them in chat to avoid interrupting, and I just figured that if there was any extra time, one or both of the speakers could choose any of the questions that they thought might be appropriate that would fit in with what they know and what their interests are.
David probably hasn't had time to look at the chat, though.
Dave, what ones are most prominent, like as far as like in your just environment? Like what are you most itching to talk about?
I mean,
your most burning question.
Yeah.
The most burning questions generally are, what can we do? What what compensation, what technology can we apply?
Well, that was one of them. That's a broad category that covers a lot of the stuff that I posted. One of the my first question was, how does this actual risk play out? And I think you've answered that. I mean, there's hormonal disruption, there's food displacement in the guts of birds and others, that kind of thing. What can we do includes things like, should we all be buying that startup company's laundry ball that you throw in with your wash that filters out the microplastics from your clothing, your poly whatever it is clothes that we all wear. And I guess my most personal question is, what is being done, if anybody knows, about getting the phthalates out of medical tubing and bags, which is noted on one of your slides, because I choose not to do phoresis anymore because I don't want my bloodstream absorbing the softeners, the phthalates, out of the tubing. And it bothers me that everybody who goes in for medical treatment, including the people who receive the blood that I donate, are getting these plastic components in their bodies, and it can't help their healing very much. So if anybody has an answer to that, I'd love to get it. But I posted my email address in there anyway. So, I don't want to use up a lot of group time on things like that.
I wanted to share, if I'm looking for the if I find the reference, I'll put it in the chat. There was a study that compared the balls that pick up lint with filters on your washing machine, and which captured more of the microplastics. The filters captured much more microplastics than the balls do. And the only issue there is that, for example, I wanted to purchase one of these filters for my washing machine, and the way my setup is, I can't fit it on there. So we haven't quite figured that out, but filtering the microplastics out is important. Of course, every time you filter, you can use scrubbers on the incinerators to remove some of those chemicals. You can put a filter on this and that, but you still have plastics left behind. And it keeps bringing me back to, let's stop producing them.
Carol,
Stop buying them.
Carol, any thoughts on, like transitioning away from, if you don't have plastic clothing, you don't have to worry about microplastics coming off of them. But that then gets into like accessibility of organic cotton clothing to people, and the expense of that, and the expense of just going and replacing your clothing. Any thoughts on that?
I don't think I have any better ideas than what you probably have about it. I mean, I'll just say this. All of this takes two things. One, a shift in focus, and two, a willingness to sacrifice in some way. We have to stop avoiding the issue of sacrificing and paying some cost. If we want to preserve the environment, we have to shift where our economy is being spent on. So when I go shopping, I knew I needed to have pants for the summer. So when I went shopping, all I did is look at the content of all the products. Yeah. Where's the cotton? Where's the cotton? Where's the cotton? Where's the organic fibers? And I chose solely based on that. Yeah. I don't, so yeah, to me, that's the underlying
what I've been doing too. I mean, it's basically just when you buy clothes, just make sure that it's natural fiber, and just make that your new standard.
But I mean, I've had to apply that to everything that I shop for.
Yeah.
I've had to change how far I drive to shop. I have to change how often. I mean, it takes it's a shift in our value system.
Yeah.
And that's just looking at this issue. Then, when you have to drive farther to buy that organic clothing, then you're, it's a complicated issue.
And we're all part of this, and there has to be some level of forgiveness for just that we're all part of this machine,
It's not easy. And all the things that you listed about things we can do are all absolutely true and all absolutely worthwhile. And we should all do all those things. But I also just want to say that please help us, everyone, when you get an action alert, a plea for taking action for the larger picture. There's a lot of movement now to have the manufacturers take more responsibility, to have Amazon stop using plastic packaging, to have Coke and Pepsi stop using plastic packaging. So they've been putting all of this burden on the individual. They need to step up and have a paradigm shift for how they package things. So please, we need everybody's help to get that message across to a higher level. So please do take action if you get from us or any other organization. There's lots of organizations working on this. You probably are all on 20 different email lists and getting action alerts from all kinds of folks, but please take action on those. And Ellen, you have your hand up. I'm going to you
Yeah, I
next.
just have a quick question. Does anybody have a kind of a brief position paper on this that you could use with legislators, either or local supervisors, you know, people who might have decision-making power about plastic bag bans? That's kind of what I'm working on, and I'd love to have something simple to, you know, be able to send them.
That's a great question and a great thing to think about and develop.
We can probably help you with that, Ellen. Just zip me an email to remind me.
I will. Okay.
Yeah, and
Ellen,
please
let me, sorry,
keep
go ahead.
me in, if you as you guys develop that type of stuff, if you would keep me and Carol in the loop. I am working with a work group, the Delaware Basin sort of oriented work group that is specifically dedicated to doing the type of thing that Ellen just mentioned, which is developing materials, guidance that can be used to go to municipalities, to go to leaders with information that they can read, that they can understand. It gives them, you know, ways to just move on things. And so,
Exactly. Yeah.
you know, that really is an area that I think can be developed in terms of just finding ways to empower people that have the time and have the energy and the desire to try to make that difference at the local level, to really give them the resources to make their job easier and to make them more empowered to do what they would like to do. Which sounds like exactly what you're talking about, Ellen.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's tons of groups that have tons of information. Surfrider has a whole plastic campaign. Oceana, Penn Environment is, Ellen, I know, is in touch with them. They're working across Pennsylvania, and I'm sure they could, and specifically in local governments, I'm sure they would be very helpful with information specific to Pennsylvania. But, you know, every jurisdiction that's worked on this issue has lots of information that can help you. It's just a matter of sort of pulling it together for what you need at the moment, you know.
Right. It needs to be direct and simple enough that, you know, using a lot of chemical terms, et cetera, is not going to cut it.
No, yeah.
I'd like to add too that there indeed, this whole concern about plastics has finally is beginning to explode, although it's still just a small group of the population that's concerned about it. But there are many good bills out there, like in Delaware, many good federal bills. There's a new federal bill about the fashion industry to regulate the chemicals and plastics that are in the fashion industry. So many people are developing some really good tools. The thing is that until your political representatives hear that you care about this, it's not going to matter. Their voters have to care. So you don't have to have any kind. I mean, it's great, you know, for Dee to send you good material, or Penn Environment, whoever, but you actually don't need to have it. For example, I spoke to our US congressperson who's very well known in Congress. I'm not going to mention her name, but she's very well respected, about how I didn't think she was taking enough leadership positions on environmental issues. And her response to me was, and she's a very wildly popular member, her response to me was, well, the population isn't that concerned. This is not their priority. Their priority is whatever, jobs and whatever. So even though I think survival kind of takes a higher precedence than everything else, so you don't have to, you see, Ellen, have to be brilliant on it. You just have to say what you think. Just say what you think and let your political representatives know, and encourage your friends to do that as well. And that's what, do you agree, Dee, that that's a good method?
I do. I mean, your personal message is often the most powerful, that elevator speech or whatever. Definitely. You know, in your own heart, coming from your own heart, like, this is why I care about this, and this is important, and you should care too. Because you don't need to and you won't have a chance to talk to them for an hour about all the details of why. But just to, yeah, I totally agree.
But I live in a situation, I live in a retirement community where I could get at least 100 signatures on a petition to somebody, but you need to have a fairly brief statement that people would sign on a petition. So, I mean, it just would
I can
be,
get you that, Ellen, no problem.
yeah,
We
good.
had one, yeah.
I'll contact you, Dee. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This has been
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful talk. Yeah. Or presentation.
All right, any other quick questions before we let everybody go? I know we've lost a few people already since we ran over probably, but that was my fault, not yours. But anyway,
We'll have-
David, sorry.
You recorded this, Dee, right? Is it?
Yes,
will it-
so
will
we'll
it-
get it up on YouTube. I'll send a link to
Okay.
everyone that registered, and if you don't mind sharing your PowerPoint, David, I can send that out to everyone too.
Or I'll send
Oh.
a PDF of it. That's
Okay.
okay. You're okay with that, Carol, as well?
Yes, absolutely. The more people who know, the better. But Dee, I want to thank you as well. Any political representative who recognizes some fundamental issues about this, it's through individual personalities often that change occurs. You know, as they say, you don't need the majority all the time, you just need a critical few. And so I really deeply appreciate when a political representative gets involved in this issue.
Oh, well, thanks. For me, this actually came first before I ran for office, but it's definitely one of my priorities. So
Interesting.
thank you, though. All right, well, this has been great talk. I apologize again for being late, but it's been really wonderful and eye-opening as expected. So thank you both, and we'll be in touch. Hopefully we can get more going in Pennsylvania. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks all.
Okay.
Well,
Thanks, Dave. Take care.
bye.